Vintners Hall, London, June 1986.
Annual lunches.
The elite of the museum world gather to honour Britain's newest growth industry.
Over 3/4 of our museums date from since the Second World War. This in itself, to my mind, is an extraordinary achievement. Increased leisure time...
Since the Museum of the Year Awards were launched in 1973, they've become the focus of stiff competition between the great national museums, the museums funded by local authorities, and the increasing number run as independent institutions. As always, the real prize is the prestige.
Well, finally, the winner of this year's title. It is a museum in which the Keel was founded, I think in the same year as National Heritage was founded itself, in 1971. It calls itself, or its copywriter calls it, I'm not quite sure which, the Great Northern Experience. It is Beamish Open Air Museum. We can only tell you, Minister, and all this audience, that for once the copywriter does not exaggerate. Here in a peaceful saucer-shaped valley, one can now see, as in a time warp, life in the Durham and Northumbrian countryside as it was half a century and more ago. It is a bold, visionary design which has conjured large sums of money out of many sources. It is exceptionally well staffed by people so warm and human that it's hard to believe that they are not in fact actors.
You make a little well in the centre.
We commend you to a very worthy winner, Beamish Open Air Museum.
For Frank Atkinson, the man who made Beamish, the Museum of the Year Award is the climax of his career. For more than 30 years, he's pursued a vision which has led to a revolution in the way we present the past.
All your staff must be very pleased. Oh, indeed.
His dream is a reality now, but back in 1968, when the BBC first made a film about him, all he could show Magnus Magnusson was an empty field in the Durham countryside.
It's an absolutely ideal site because it's basin-shaped, it's got woods all the way around it, there's a river running through the middle of it, and what's more, it's pretty well typical of the sort of countryside that one gets in the northeast. This is what we want, something which will really typify the whole region. The limit is these woods along here, the woods you can see along the near skyline there, those woods all along practically along the skyline. So the whole area, which is about 300 acres, with the hall down in the bottom and the farm on the way down to the hall, really is a very attractive unit. I see that farm, which is now semi-derelict, as being capable of being brought back into its mid-19th century state, so that visitors would have an admirable opportunity of seeing just what mid-19th century farming was like in these parts.
And Frank Atkinson was interested in more than just farming. In the past 20 years or so, Beamish Open Air Museum has acquired 2 coal mines, a slag heap, a railway, a tram system, and a complete town street. In these fields and woods, Atkinson has laid out the buildings and the machinery that has shaped the life of the Northeast in the 19th and early 20th century. And then he's brought it all to life with people. An industrial landscape may not be the Garden of Eden, but this, without a doubt, is Frank Atkinson's creation.
Today, a museum that brings the past to life, that does not keep its collections in glass cases, and that celebrates not the history of the rich and famous, but the objects of everyday existence, seems so natural that it's difficult to appreciate the novelty of Frank Atkinson's idea.
Something different. He'd probably say to one chap, take a couple of props in with you. There's wooden props over there, what keeps the roof up. He might say, take a couple of props in with you. You've got a bit of bad roof today.
Almost as though it were a full-scale model railway, a playbox farm or a toy town, the working and social life of the Northeast has been recreated on a single site. It's It's a place where any visitor born before the war will feel at home.
Yes. So you wrapped your stocking round your button and through that hole. And if you lost your button, you put a tanner in. You were in the back.
Now, Beamish is one of the Northeast's biggest tourist attractions. 30 years ago, the idea was a startling proposition, both to museum professionals and to the authorities that employ them. Frank Atkinson had to create a museum and its collection from scratch. And first, he had to convince people that it could be done.
I suppose some people would say it was a bit of a con job because we had to start collecting long before there was any certainty of what we were going to do or how we were going to use what we were collecting.
And what were you collecting?
Well, we started collecting for this area in 1958, which is when I came into the region and got authority from my committee of the day to start collecting the social history of County Durham originally. Primarily the things that were rapidly disappearing as they were then. I mean, virtually they've all gone now, and the sort of things that you see around us, probably one couldn't collect most of them now, or at most they'll be in antique shops and the like, and have lost their association with the real people. And we worked on the principle, you offer it to us and we'll collect it. And in that way, we built up a remarkable collection, an entirely unselective collection that, in fact, can't be beaten now in this country.
Have you always collected things?
Yes, well, as long as I can remember. As a small boy, I collected. I can still remember collecting my first fossil, and that was very exciting. I suppose I'd be about 9 or 10 then. And that's when I started collecting seriously.
And did you then have your own museum?
I had my own small museum. My father, in fact, built a little hut at the bottom of the garden, supposedly for my brother and me to share, but I took it over. I was the elder one. And it became a museum quite rapidly. I scrounged old glass cases from shops and things like that and built up quite a collection. A lot of it was First World War stuff, you know, bayonets and tin hats and things like that. But I had quite a good collection of beetles. I became quite interested in beetles, coins.
Sounds as though you were a sort of incipient kleptomaniac.
I should think, in fact, I think anybody really to work in a museum like this has to be a sort of sublimated kleptomaniac, I think.
In the early 1950s, Frank Atkinson was making his way up the professional museum ladder. And it was while looking at museums in Scandinavia in 1952 that he came across Norway's open-air folk museum at Lillehammer. Here, visitors can see the agricultural life of Norway as it was lived before machinery changed its customs and modernization threatened these buildings. An idea was born.
I can still remember one particular spot where, because I was traveling around on my own, and one evening, lovely evening, I was on a little bridge, tiny little bridge across one of the little lakes on the hillside, and I can still remember it, leaning there and saying to myself, really, we must do something like that in this country, in England. We must, I felt, and happily we have done.
But there was a long way to go from a flash of inspiration on a bridge in Norway to the Beamish of today. And in 1952, Frank Atkinson had neither a museum nor a single object to display. Then, in 1958, he was put in charge of the Bowes Museum at Barnard Castle, County Durham. No folk museum this, but a chateau built by a rich Victorian landowner for his French wife and filled with the fine art of France. But behind the scenes, in the attics and basements, the sublimated kleptomaniac was assembling an entirely different kind of collection. Rosemary Allen looked after it then, as she does today.
I worked up in the fly rooms, as they were called, in the top of the Bowes Museum, with some of the collections which Frank had built up, going back as far as 1958. And I was absolutely inundated by telephone calls from people offering everything from a mangle to a sewing machine to a POS tub, you name it. It was being offered, and I had to filter these, decide whether or not we wanted them, and in fact we did collect just about everything that we were offered then, and to arrange for the collection. Now this sounded quite easy when you were talking about a POS tub, but one day somebody told me I had to arrange the collection of an enormous lathe from Hawkswell's foundry in Durham, and I dread to think of this experience because I had never done anything like this before. and I had to go out, find out how heavy this piece of equipment was, organise a crane and a low loader, and go out and collect it. So it was really quite exciting.
Before long, all the odd corners were filled up there, and we took over a disused army camp. We moved several times. We started with what had been a tank store, because there had been a lot of camps around Castle, and we had half filled that when the army decided they wanted to move back, so we had to move out of there. And then we moved to Branspeth camp, which was the camp of the old DLI, which were just being closed down at that point. So we had an enormous camp with barrack square and enormous ranges of barrack buildings and so on. And gradually, bit by bit, we filled that up until, by the time Beamish actually started in 1970, almost the whole of that camp was bulging.
As the collection grew, so did the demands on the skills of the people involved. Ian Walden was recruited because he'd been trained as an engineer.
Frank was very good at persuading people to give him things and worrying about how he was going to move them later. I think the first job I ever did was to go down and move Blacksmith's shop with the roof tiles, which were the stone tiles, and weighed about half a hundredweight each. And there were things like gasworks, which he hadn't worried about how you're going to move them. It was a case of, well, now I've got somebody who can move them. And of course, my introduction to Beamish was actually getting the navvy out of umpteen feet of mud when it was stuck. And there it was, 100 ton of scrap iron stuck up to its axles, more or less, although it was track drive, about 100 yards from where he wanted it to be. And that sort of taxed everybody's ingenuity for a bit as to how to get it out.
And where is it now?
Well, it's 100 yards from where it was when I started. And they daren't move it in case it gets lost again. It's sitting in the middle of the Beamish site. The general reaction was, here's a nutter with an idea, and he'll never get anywhere. But he got at it by sheer persistence. I remember him saying he'd done something like 1,000 lectures, the same lecture 1,000 times to different organisations. He just decided he was going to get this museum off the ground and made it work, and it was sheer dogged persistence.
Oh, you have to, I see, so that stays on the same,
That's it. That's
the same position, but this moves up and down to it.
That's right.
I've got it, yes.
Don't eat me.
Now, after 30 years, that persistence has been rewarded. The rusting machinery has been refurbished, buildings have been taken down, moved brick by brick, rebuilt and brought back to life. The Beamish tram snaked through what looks like, and sometimes has been used as, the location for a nostalgic costume drama.
We're not trying to be biased in any direction. We're not trying to say, for instance, these were the good old days, any more than we're trying to say these were the bad old days. I mean, they were both, in a sense. It depended who you were and where you were at any point. So what we're trying to say, in a sense, is these were the days. This is how it was. Take it or leave it. Draw your own conclusions.
How important was it for you when you were gathering this material, that the way the life in the northeast was changing there?
Well, in the 50s and 60s, and even more so in the 70s, things were changing pretty rapidly. And what we were trying to do was collect this material before it all went, because...
but not just material, communities.
Well, yes, communities. I think of material as being the first thing, because the community is built around its material, whether it is its houses or its furniture or its workplace or whatever. And it was all that we were trying to save. And we've done a lot, not as much as I would like, but a lot of oral recording, saving the records of, saving the recollections of elderly people, which help to set the scene for objects like this, so that a town street like this, for instance, which really does show you how life was lived in the northeast in the 1920s, comes to life much more when you can go into the houses and see just how people would live and work in this sort of environment. The co-op across the road, surprising how many people, when they go in there, remember their co-op divvy number that they haven't used for years. It brings it all back to people.
That was something nice to look forward to, though, your dividends. Yes,
Walk into Beamish's co-op shop, which once stood in the mining village of Anfield Plains High Street, and you enter a time warp. You pat your pockets for the big old pennies and halfpennies of childhood, when 5p was a shilling and a 10-bob note was a fortune.
Oh, I remember this. Change. Yes.
for all 1925 prices in here. That's the year we based the shop on, 1925. Prices and the dividend.
In the 1960s, all this was still a dream. As the collections piled up, Frank Atkinson had to persuade a whole group of local authorities to open their purses in order to be able to buy a suitable site. There were 30 possibilities, eventually narrowed down to 5. Then, in November 1968, he brought a working party of local councillors to Beamish Hall, on the edge of the 200-acre estate. It was love at first sight. The working party chairman was Mabel Macmillan.
Well, I would hope that the future for an open-air museum in the north of England is indeed a rosy one. I think that most of you will appreciate...
I was a Middlesbrough councillor for nearly 16 years, and I think that you have to admit that local government councillors are looking at every penny. And you've got to also remember that you can sit down in a council chamber with your annual budget and decide what you're going to do next year. But this wasn't on that basis at all. This was going to be a long-term project, and no one had any idea but that it was going to begin small and it was going to grow, as indeed it has. And remember, we're going back 20 years because it was 1966 when this project first began. And you have to remember that each councillor has a vote. And when you get in a council chamber, you've got those who think museums are a waste of money and the past is a waste of money and live in the present and look to the future. So it was an uphill battle.
Oh, we had several ups and downs. I used to think of it rather like trying to push a steamroller roller single-handed uphill, and you'd get it 1 foot forwards and it would roll back 2 feet. It was like that very much. But it was very difficult when one was trying to create something that really was, to most people, a pig in a poke. They didn't know really what they were buying. There wasn't anywhere where I could go and see one. Here we were selling something unseen, and in public terms that's not easy. The whole idea of moving buildings onto a site and inviting people to come and look at things happening in those buildings was completely unknown when we were talking in the 60s. There was nothing like it in this country. Lots abroad, of course, in Scandinavia, but nothing really in England at all. The Welsh National Museum to an extent, but really nothing else. Even after the museum was started, we came to the stage where we were ready to start planning, establishing the town street. And I well remember going to committee with this idea, and one of the councillors, a very influential councillor, saying, but you can't get madder than that. The idea of setting up a co-op in the middle of a cornfield. And, you know, put that way, it does sound pretty mad. But now, of course, everyone is delighted and says, yes, what an excellent idea. And it wins the Museum of the Year award. But at the time, it was touch and go as to whether anyone would actually believe it possible.
With 1 foot on the site and the promise of local authority money, Frank Atkinson now began selling his idea to the public. A friends organisation was set up and a press conference called.
When I tell you that, for instance, at the moment, things, that is to say actual individual specimens or groups of material, are being offered at the rate of just about one a day, and this has now been going on for several years, you realise the size of the collection, because when
Atkinson has always understood the importance of good relations with the press. One of the reasons for the success of Beamish has been his mastery of the art of public relations. Even when there was little to see on the ground, he was able to create enough news interest to keep the press and the public coming back for more.
I believe that an eighth of a penny in the region would probably yield somewhere about £60,000 per annum.
Today, though the museum now earns 2/3 of its income from entrance fees, Frank Atkinson is still as dependent as he was on local authority support. With growth and the changes in local government, the working of the museum's joint committee has become more complicated, but it has also become more cordial.
I was quite surprised to have sent to me an item from Hansard. I think this is the first time that we've appeared in Hansard in many years. And I've detailed the motion there at the bottom of page 2, which was apparently set in the name of Mr. Giles Radici, who is the Member of Parliament representing the...
Beamish's favourable mention at Westminster is a tribute to the years he spent honing his political skills.
That's very encouraging.
He had to make himself known, And he used to spend 1, if not 2 days a week at County Hall in Durham, being in the right place at the right time. So people knew his face, they knew who he was, they knew he'd got this idea. He knew, and as long as I knew him, always knew which councillor was where, who pulled the strings, which officers were on his side and which weren't. And he's a good local authority officer, more of a politician than many other politicians, I suspect.
He's tremendous. I don't know of anybody else who has the knack of interviewing, for instance, an ex-miner and talking to him about experiences working underground, to going to talk to politicians in Whitehall to get money for the museum. And it's this great talent, I think, which has put Beamish on the map and has really made sure that we are firmly established here.
When it opened in 1971, Beamish was in at the beginning of a new wave of museum building. Britain seemed to wake up to the splendours of its industrial past, just as old industries began to spiral into decline. Now, as I travel around the country and see new museums sprouting everywhere, I begin to wonder if the whole country is not becoming one vast open-air museum. Another town street, another recreation of the industrial past, and another open-air museum. This is the Ironbridge Gorge Museum in Shropshire, based on the once thriving industries of this valley. Ironbridge is almost an exact contemporary of Beamish. Its director, Stuart Smith, began his museum career in the northeast of England. But Ironbridge works on a quite different philosophy.
Oh, the major difference, of course, is that Ironbridge concentrates on preserving buildings and sites where they've all been before. I mean, we are involved in the preservation of monuments in their original locations, whereas Beamish has demolished monuments and sites from all over the northeast and brought them together into one particular location. That obviously makes economic sense, but doesn't make a great deal of sense in archaeological terms. So we are a network of different sites. We altogether look after 25 or more different sites in the Ironbridge Gorge. Whereas Beamish is, of course, just one single location.
But how scholarly can you really be when you're dealing with massive buildings and so on?
Well, there have been many PhDs written about that particular bridge, may I say. I mean, we still don't know how the bridge was even put together, so many people still speculate on its construction. People have analysed it, looked at its metallurgical significance. There's a whole academic field which must be explored in the industrial archaeological sense.
Yeah, I think so. You've got the flow as well as the the movement of the iron, haven't you? Try to get these just a little bit thicker, because if you notice, the central parts are just a little bit thicker, aren't they?
Yeah. We, of course, at Ironbridge have a university department, which we run with the University of Birmingham, where we train industrial archaeologists, where we're now going to train heritage managers in the next 18 months to go off and manage other projects, because I feel that the heritage movement must be based on academic work before you can actually then popularise it for the public.
But even Ironbridge, it seems, goes in for a little set dressing. These giant blast furnaces are still in situ, standing where they've always stood. But this 19th century squatter's cottage has been dismantled from its original site and rebuilt within the museum, like most of the buildings at Beamish. So has this canal bridge, and yet another town street. This time we're in the Black Country Museum at Dudley in the West Midlands. Though all its elements are genuine, like this refurbished tramcar, this too is an invention, a dream brought to life over the last 10 years by its director, Ian Walden.
What you have in common is a desire to say something about the area. And that means you collect specimens, you display them, and you bring them to life. And we all do it in slightly different ways, because in the main, museums are reflections of the directors, and directors are the people who make them work. But equally, they are reflections of the differences of the area, the difference between coal mining in the northeast and coal mining in the Midlands, or the different sort of building.
Tell me how you actually set up the scene behind you.
everything we have put in except the canal, essentially. This piece of canal behind us when we started was derelict land full of all sorts of rubbish, and the site was the edge of a sewage works, and we wanted to show the history of the Black Country. So we wanted to show canal boats, we wanted to show how they were restored and how they worked. So we brought in canal boats, we dredged out the canal, we decorated the canal boats, we put people onto them, and we demonstrate them from time to time. So we've taken that philosophy right through.
Isn't there an element of pastiche in all this? Isn't there a bit of trickery?
Oh, yes. I mean, we're trying to show 200, 250 years of history on a 400 square mile area, all on 26 acres, all seen in a 2.5-hour visit. It's got to be fake. We've got to mix things together. But our basic premises are, I hope, those of the proper museum, in that what we collect is an exact item, in that how we display it should be as accurately as possible, in that the costumes of the people, the work they use, the story they tell should all be correct, so that we can really put over what went on. We are putting together and showing the bricks, the buildings that did exist in the Black Country. The only thing that's fake is they're not where they were originally.
And who taught you to do that?
Oh, a lot of it's down to Frank. He had this strong belief in doing things properly. He was a museum man at heart. That's what a lot of people didn't understand, that he went from being a museum man with all the skills and the beliefs to being the showman, because by being the showman he could do the story, tell the story that he wanted to tell as a museum man.
Come right in, ladies and gentlemen. I'm boys and girls.
The coal mine back at Beamish. Pure showmanship.
What we've got here, as you can see straight in front of you, is just an old hand pick and a filling shovel. And that old thing there, an old pit too, is mainly what you were after, because that...
Curiously enough, this drift mine cut into the hillside is genuine. They uncovered it when they took over the museum site. But to display a working pithead, they had to dismantle this winding engine, which originally stood half a mile away outside the museum. Now moved and rebuilt, it's powered by modern machinery. The coal shaft it serves is only a few feet deep, and the pit heap beside it is a loving recreation.
Wasn't there a certain amount of criticism of the fact that you actually decided to move this building, even if only half a mile? Because by doing that, it was less authentic as a result.
Well, that's a point of view, certainly. I mean, that is argued with every building we move. And in a sense, I accept that. I mean, I agree. Ideally, a building kept in situ is much more genuinely preserved. But you see, the reason for it, really, is that it helps tell a complete story. Because we are setting up here a mining situation, coal mining situation, so that not only have we got a drift mine, all the working area, there is still more to be built. There are workshops and tub shops and things like that. This winding engine house, the very pit heap itself. We've recreated this pit heap, by the way.
Yes, so you've built...
We've recreated that. That's right,
heap.
yes. It still has to have what we call its top dressing on it, because it's got to have more authentic shale on top of it. But when that's finished, that will be the only preserved pit heap in Europe that I know of, as part of the environment. Even though it isn't a real pit heap? Even though it's not, well, yeah. All right, it's not a real pit heap, but it's more real than most of the pit heaps that now remain under grassed over.
I mean, isn't there a bit of faking in all this?
Not faking, creating an environment is the way I see it. OK, you can argue that it's playing with words, but I think it is important that we recreate a convincing environment, and to do it, if it needs a pit heap, then one has to recreate a pit heap.
And the show has to go on. Not surprisingly for Britain's newest growth industry, open-air museums are now big business.
It's Geordie's Heritage Day. That's right, yes. It's an event we've held before, but we're hoping to get sponsorship this year. So we look to have about 5,000 to spend on advertising.
Beamish has an annual turnover of £900,000 and provides jobs for more than 200 people. With the exception of Durham Cathedral, which has been going rather longer, Beamish is now the North East's biggest tourist attraction. And the 300,000 or so visitors who come each year bring their money not just to Beamish, but to the surrounding area as well, an important factor in a period of high unemployment. Isn't there a tension between a museum, the idea of a museum, and this, which is more like, what, Disneyland, dare I say?
You dare not say it. This isn't Disneyland. I have a great respect for Disneyland, but it's a different sort of thing. But yes, we don't think of this as a museum in some senses. I mean, you may notice we call it Beamish. Occasionally on road signs we have to have Beamish Museum because there's still a village called Beamish. But we think of it as a concept, as Beamish. And I'm happy to say that the local papers, the regional papers now accept that, and you'll see headlines in the local dailies with the word Beamish only, and it's accepted that the readers know what that concept is. That's good, I think, because one has got away there from the concept of the traditional museum with things static and preserved and in glass cases and with labels and so on. Whereas here, the place speaks for itself. I mean, the street with the tram and the people enjoying themselves and going into the buildings and everything alive. But at the same time, behind the scenes, we are collecting and preserving the heritage of the region, and that is the other half. The two must come together. Without either one, it's not possible.
You said at the beginning that Frank was thought of as a bit of a nutter in the museum world. How is Frank seen in the museum world now?
I don't think he's quite yet an elder statesman, but certainly he is regarded as somebody who has changed the museum world. In the early days, it was, well, he's got this idea, and it's probably not terribly serious, and it won't do anything. People now look back and say that was perhaps the watershed of a better public awareness of museums, better public involvement in museums, or popularisation of museums. And I think that's really what he will be best known for. There are still those who don't realise how good a museum Beamish is museologically, because they still think of it as Frank's toy.
Well, I think he has a very high esteem, a high regard. Certainly, he's known as a man who gets things done, and emerging from sort of the local authority sort of syndrome of the 1950s and 60s, he actually created himself a complete new museum. It's been so inspirational that now museums are being created about 2 a week, probably far too many in fact, but it's people like Frank who showed the way, showed how it could be done.
Okay, when you're ready.
History itself never ends, so where does Beamish stop? Although there's still a great deal to be done, Frank Atkinson believes the museum is likely to remain firmly in the 20s and 30s, before the North East began to lose its unique character.
But it'll just fasten down now and be okay for a long time to come?
We hope so, yes.
But with the opening of the new visitors' centre, Frank Atkinson's thoughts are turning towards his own retirement. There are books he wants to write, and there are plans for starting another museum, a small one devoted to the Tyneside wood engraver Thomas Buick. His faith in open-air museums burns as brightly as ever, and when we went up to the spot where he'd stood with Magnus Magnusson in 1968, now, instead of an empty field, is the Beamish that he has created. Frank, you've taken this landscape, you've filled it with buildings, with machinery, and above all, with all these people. Did you ever feel, perhaps, that you were playing God?
No, I don't think so. I must admit that I like having my own way. And in a sense, this is the greatest opportunity one could have had. I mean, without all the people who are involved, not only the staff, but the councillors and the people who have made it possible. Without all that, it clearly couldn't have happened. So, no, I don't think so. Deus ex machina, I suppose, in a sense, that one is the power behind the scenes, but not in the godlike sense, no, just the satisfaction of being able to do it.
Don't you think it's ironic that you've been using industrial dereliction to actually revitalise a part of the country?
It is ironic that we had to be collecting at a time when the region was being rapidly run down. In fact, it made our work much more difficult because things were disappearing at such a rate that we had to run fast to collect the stuff as it fell, if you like. And that was sad. It is sad, too, I think, that this region, and of course this region isn't alone in this, has suffered so much. If you like, if one is clutching at straws, it makes the contrast between what Beamish shows as it was and what it is now all the greater. But yes, I think it's very unfortunate. On the other hand, it's nice to know that as a tourist attraction, as an employer of staff, Beamish has yet another reason for being in existence, which it didn't have when we started. There is one particular spot I could take you to down near the railway area where one can sit on the bank there and watch the locos in steam and the town busy and the tram running past and hundreds of people down there, thousands of people there enjoying themselves. And, you know, it's possible to think, as I must admit I do sometimes, isn't that marvellous? I actually managed to get that done so that all those people can enjoy themselves. And all these people, 200 or more of them, in work who weren't here at all 10 years or more ago. So that's very satisfying, yes. I once heard a lady explaining to her child what Beamish was about. She just happened to be passing me at the time, and she was explaining to the child what it was, and she said, it's bits and pieces of history. And in a sense, that's what Beamish is, I think. Bits and pieces brought to life, connected together, and each one very carefully researched and very carefully worked out with its own scenario, but together helping to give people an impression of what the Northeast was about and how it has become what it has.